Energy Transition Now with David Linden.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, David Linden, the head of energy transition for the Westwood Global Energy Group, and you're listening to Energy Transition Now. Offshore wind is a renewable energy source that is set for dramatic growth. Here at Westwood, we forecast that today's just over 50 gigawatts of global installed capacity is set to shoot up to almost 350 gigawatts just by the end of this decade. But the question, of course, on everyone's lips is, how are we going to deliver all of this capacity? To give us their perspective on things, I'm really pleased to have Tim Pick as my guest here today. Tim's the recently appointed Offshore Wind Champion for the UK. I think a country that has historically made a big impact in the sector, but now wants to do even more. Good to have you on the show, Tim.
Thanks very much, David. Nice to be here.
So look, it's you are relatively new into this role. I believe it started off in May, and you're also relatively new in the grand scheme of what you could call new in the offshore wind sector. Because not maybe many people might have heard of you before, it would just be great to get a little bit of background on yourself, how you've got to where you've got to today, just sort of maybe fill in some of those historical gaps for us.
Yeah, no problem, David. So I'm a project development lawyer by training and experience. I've spent about 27 years, since about 1996, working with project development teams on large-scale energy infrastructure, supporting those teams from conception of the project, initial MOUs, framework agreements, all the way through to financial close and construction. It's been my absolute bread and butter for nearly 3 decades now, including about 10 plus years living in Abu Dhabi in the Middle East, and then, given the nature of the industry, a vast amount of travel, projects all around the world. As you said, relatively new to offshore wind, so I come at this with quite a heavy oil and gas, thermal power, aluminium smelters, refining and petchem type of background. Interestingly, Minister Hans, in my first meeting with him, suggested that this was some kind of elaborate carbon offsetting arrangement where I was now paying some sort of penance for my previous life. But no, it's been a real pleasure to get stuck into offshore wind.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I don't think you're anyone. I think every second person that you meet who's now in offshore wind was once in the oil and gas sector. So it's quite a common theme, I guess. Okay, so but let's talk a little bit about maybe offshore wind specifically itself. So many countries in the world have the opportunity to have offshore wind, but it's somehow sort of developed quite quickly here in the UK. And until last year, when I guess the Chinese market overtook the UK, it was the largest offshore wind market in the world. Now we're putting more in place to grow this market even further. What is it about offshore wind that's so important here in the UK? Why are we talking about it so much?
Well, first of all, one of my overriding impressions of the sector so far, before we get into the technicalities, is people love working in this sector. I went to the Global Offshore Wind Conference in Manchester a few weeks ago. It's one of the most positive experiences of my life. I've never seen an industry that buzzes like this one. People genuinely they really understand that they're doing something globally significant, working at that sort of complex sort of interface of climate change, politics, industry, and innovation. So super exciting, and I've really drunk the Kool-Aid since then. In fact, I think my wife's got sick of me talking about offshore wind and the challenges it faces. So going to the sort of UK pipeline. So those of you who read government announcements may have picked up on the British Energy Security Strategy that was published in April. This new strategy is obviously focused on energy security in terms of what can we produce in the UK for the UK. wind is abundant. We have something like 880,000 square kilometers of territorial waters, way bigger than any other North European countries, multiples of places like Germany and the Netherlands. Um, so it's an obvious source of zero marginal cost electricity to harness. And the security strategy, I guess, recognized that by bumping the target yet again. So we've had a target of 30 gigawatts by 2030, then 40. Now we've bumped the target to 50. Um,
Yeah.
we're with 8 years to go. Let's hope nobody bumps it again, because we really are closing in on something very difficult now.
Absolutely. I mean, it is that kind of ambition which is quite amazing. I think other phrases like trying to be the Saudi Arabia of the offshore wind is another one that sort of maybe speaks to the ambition. But I guess the reality, as far as I remember from that document, is targeting so that the reason we're looking at that volume is because it should be enough offshore wind to power every UK home by 2030. Not every bit of power that we require, but certainly every UK home should be powered or could be powered by offshore wind in theory by then. Am I remembering that correctly?
No, that's correct. And I think one of the things I'm keen for people to do, um, and again, my friends probably don't like me banging on about this, but I think people need to be more connected with the source of generation. I think we've all got very comfortable with the idea that electricity arrives in our homes, it goes into the plug, you have no idea where it comes from. And if you download the National Grid ESO app or something like, one of those sort of apps, and actually have a look at where it's coming from, it's fascinating. First of all, you see it really shows you what progress the UK has made. Some days you look at that app and offshore wind is up there at 50%. Um, but it also shows you we've got a way to go. There's still a lot of gas-fired power in there. Um, and obviously that currently drives the pricing in the wholesale market. There's some reform proposed for that, but we have a way to go before we're doing every home on offshore wind.
No, absolutely, absolutely. But it's the ambition, I guess, that's there, and I guess that takes me sort of to my next question around, you know, having an offshore wind champion. Not many sectors have champions. There's often companies who are seen as champions of that industry. I think in the US, you have got some kind of climate champions or clean energy champions that have been selected, etc. But this is kind of the UK's first, certainly offshore wind champion. You know, maybe, well, two things. Why do we need one? Why do we need an offshore wind champion? This is not a job interview, by the way, but it is. I guess it's useful in the context of what we're trying to do. And also, what role do they ultimately play?
Yeah, so it's a super interesting question, and actually one that I was asking myself during the interview process. Um, I think the role. Just going back, first of all, going back to the energy security strategy, one of the concepts in there. So the way to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind in the UK is to accelerate the existing pipeline. Um, the existing pipeline is what it is, um, with a process per project of usually around a decade from lease award through to financial investment decision and commencement of construction. Decade or 12 years, something like that. It's a very long period of time. And if you think about that in terms of technology evolution, you start out with, if you only look over the last 10 years, beginning of that period, you may have had 3 or 4 megawatt turbines. You're now up at 16 megawatts. So it's it just feels cumbersome. And so the security strategy proposed the establishment of something called the Offshore Wind Acceleration Task Force, um, which is a cross-government industry group of people, not a decision-making body, but a body which is put together to try and unpack that 10, 12-year cycle, look at bottlenecks, look at friction in the system, see what can be done to ease the path. So if you can get the 10 or 12 years down to 5 or 6 years, the 50 gigawatts is pretty deliverable. But it's a big challenge because there's some thorny issues in there, like grid connections, planning permission, etc. So yeah, why a champion? I think there's a couple of reasons for it. First of all, to have someone whose sole focus is on this acceleration agenda, and essentially so I co-chair the task force with Minister Hans, but he obviously has a massive waterfront of energy policy to deal with. My sole task is to follow up the work of the task force. So it's it's providing a bit of execute or sort of follow-up capability, I guess, and someone to quarterback the work. That's one part of it. And I think the second part, which has actually been more interesting for me, has been it puts someone who's half in and half outside the government system, half in and half outside industry. Um, and so in this role, you can have lots of very direct cross-cutting conversations with people at all different levels in different stakeholders, um, that they find difficult to have with each other, or there's hierarchy issues getting in the way, or just formality getting in the way. And so that's been that's one of the key benefits of the role, is the access you get to all stakeholders at a senior level, which allows you to talk to them frankly, ask them to do stuff, remind them of their task force commitments, etc.
Excellent. Yeah, and it's an interesting one because I mean you mentioned the Global Offshore Wind event a couple of weeks ago or so. Probably a bit longer. It feels like 3 weeks ago now since we're talking at least. But within that, it was interesting because previous conferences had felt like it was starting to stick. The topics were repetitive, if you put it in those words. Nothing wrong with the conference itself, but it's clear that people were stuck in where they were going. Well, this year it started to feel much more like, hang on, we actually know what the issues are. We just need to go about solving them. And here are some of the ways we could solve them. So ideas were coming out as how to solve them. And I guess a champion as such for the UK at least is one of those things. Like, we know what the problems are, let's go and try and solve them. And we know some of these are, as you say, cross-cutting issues you simply can't solve in what I guess are historically silos, right? So we'll come onto the challenges and those things in just a minute, but there've been silos that have existed across the energy industry for quite some time. How do you cut across them and help everybody see and be aligned in maybe trying to solve some of these things?
No, look, that's correct, David. And I think the other aspect, which I probably should have touched on earlier, is coming at it cold, or relatively cold, but with a lot of project development experience, has allowed me to ask some pretty dumb questions, or to to probe things that look a bit odd from a sort of international or cross-industry perspective. Um, and sometimes you ask a dumb question, you get an even more dumb answer, and then you think, well, I better deal with that as part of the task force. So um, it's it, yeah, it's allowed me to. I came at it with no agenda, not much prior knowledge, and I've been able to question everything. Um, and obviously that you can only do that for so long, until there's going to come a point where I'm part of the furniture, and quite honestly part of the problem, and at that point I will leave the building.
Well, hopefully not too soon. There's a few things to be done, but I know what you're saying, and actually asking some of the dumb questions is sometimes the easiest way to solve the problem as well. So um, I can see that. Now, I mean, you started to talk about some of these things, but the to-do list can get quite long. But what are when you're looking at this sector, what are some of those key challenges? If you could just bucket them up or break them down a little bit for us, that you are seeing, that you are coming across, and that you're thinking about. Look, hang on here. This is the to-do list that we need to think about. These are the areas that the UK needs to drive at.
Yep. So I think there are a few buckets here. So I think there are some. I think you will see in some of the work the Crown Estate does, and moving forward to Celtic Sea leasing round next year, you will see a more joined up approach between Crown Estate and National Grid, for example, and quite a lot of pre work done by Crown Estate on environmental issues, so that the development community, when they're bidding for those leases, has a bit clearer line of sight to project development than they maybe have had before. So there's a package around leasing, and as we do more of this work and we have more wind farms and more leasing, you get into a more strategic issue for the UK as a whole, which is how do we use our marine space? And so, as you'd imagine, there are teams within government that have that responsibility, and there's a bit of focus now on looking at that through the lens of offshore wind and ensuring that the different users of the sea, and that's everything from fishing to leisure to oil and gas to carbon storage, to conservation and environmental protection and offshore wind, how we ensure that everyone can coexist and go about their business in a fair and an equitable way. So there's a bucket of, let's say, site selection, um, site selection and leasing issues. I would say that's one bucket. There's a second bucket, which is very much the focus of the energy security strategy on the consenting and licensing process, or effectively the planning permission type process for offshore wind. The mechanisms we have for that, particularly around some of the environmental issues and the way you compensate for environmental deterioration, need to be updated. And so we'll see in the energy bill coming through Parliament, hopefully, some tweaks to that regime to make it more fit for purpose as we get larger wind farm deployment, while still maintaining, quite honestly, the UK's world leading position on environmental protection. So this is not about riding roughshod over the environment. And I think most people in the industry that you come across would absolutely support that. I mean, if you're in this industry because you think it's the right thing and you're mitigating climate change, the last thing you want to do is be causing harm to the environment. So it's I think it's more about making the system work rather than finding shortcuts or something like that. So there's a planning and environment part. There's a whole other bucket of issues around grid. And you've seen the recent publication of the holistic network design, which starts to go some way towards coordination of the new look grid with the offshore wind world. Ideally reducing the number of radial connections into UK beaches, which has been a source of irritation for communities for a long time. But generally recognizing that we have to get the power to where it's needed, and we're not in the world of gas-fired power plants, which you can build on the edge of cities now. We're in the world of windy spots miles offshore and well away from centres of demand. So naturally, you have to build more cabling. Ideally offshore, but you can't offshore absolutely everything. And hopefully society will recognise that there is a need to get power to where it's needed, and there will be some disruption on shore. And then finally, I think the area that I never sort of appreciated I would get so involved with is the sort of issues around ports and supply chains. So as we ramp up our ambition for deployment, we're putting huge pressure on the supply chain. And we're doing that at a time where many other countries are doing the same thing. So how do we support the development of a sustainable supply chain in the UK that can actually deliver? It's fine to get the planning permission moving, but if no one's around to build the stuff or supply the equipment, then that's a real problem. So supporting a sustainable supply chain is a seriously important part of the exercise. And if we wind the clock forward to floating offshore wind, there's quite a lot of anticipatory work that needs to be done to support that deployment, particularly in ports.
Yes, absolutely. No, we had someone on our podcast a few episodes ago to talk about that specifically, and the sort of plethora of technologies available, the roles that ports can play, and the complexities around still. How do you need to be incentivized from I guess a commercial perspective, but also just generally, how do you build this in the most efficient manner while choosing the right technology, etc., starts to become very complicated. And everyone's had this sort of fixed bottom mindset for so long. Once you start looking at floating, it opens up another whole world of other issues that you need to deal with. It solves a lot of other things, but it also creates a lot of other issues that you need to solve.
Agreed, and I think we need to recognise that large-scale floating structures are not so new for the UK. And our oil and gas
True.
community have worked with those for a long time. I think the difference here is the scale of serial production you need for these very large pieces of kit, and that requires very large port facilities, lots of space for both dry and wet storage, lots of assembly yards, big cranes. Um, and you can't start building those in 2030 to deploy in 2030 because they're actually quite large port projects in their own right that take 5-6 years to plan and build. So there's a need to stimulate some investment there. And anyone who, again, I'm not sure there are that many people read the government website so closely, but when my appointment was announced, it was announced together with something called the Flow MIS scheme, which is a grant scheme which will be targeted at stimulatory investment for floating wind deployment. So lots of work going on there. The RFI for that has just closed as we speak, and in parallel there is a industry and government floating offshore wind task force, which is trying to produce an industrialization roadmap to provide some very clear recommendations as to where we should place our bets, if you like, as a country on this technology. Not to try and, I don't think it's government's role to select the technology. That's clearly an industry-led activity, but it's certainly government's role to create the right environment so that port companies can feel confident to invest probably 5 years out from deployment.
Yes. Okay. Absolutely, no, it's hugely important, and I think the UK in particular has been the sense that in the past has missed out on some of those supply chain opportunities, and so is very keen to get it right on the floating wind side. But let me ask you just about that. Well, quite a large to-do list if you think about it. You've nicely bucketed for us, but there are quite a few complicated cross-cutting issues there that some folks have said that they're addressing in one way or another. There are different bodies, as you say, there's different task forces and etc. But in terms of your role specifically, and I guess that was one of the reasons to bring you on to here, was just to get, what is what you're doing really, you're having these discussion at the kind of call it that cross-cutting, I don't want to say high level, but the OWAT level, let's just say. And that's the conduit that you could provide for people to have those conversations so they can be, call yourself a facilitator in that sense for these things. Or do you see yourself playing a slightly different role?
No, there's definitely a facilitator side of this. And, if you think about changes to planning, for example, obviously the government leads on legislative change, and then the relevant government departments lead on the implementation of that and what it means for resourcing and skills in the relevant statutory bodies. So I think at the OAT level, we keep the pressure on those people, which is important, and we have ministerial attention to ensure that the pressure is kept on and that those things don't drop off the to-do list or get put in the too difficult box. So it's a facilitation role, and it's also a little bit of a whack-a-mole type role. So from time to time, things come up where it's possible for me to just jump into a conversation and help move it in the right direction. And that obviously comes with the nature of the appointment and people in the room recognizing that if necessary, you can light a fire under it with ministers or whatever. And frankly, I haven't had to do that because I think people, in general, everyone is pulling in the same direction. I've not heard anyone say we shouldn't accelerate offshore wind. I've not heard anyone say that these processes are perfect as they stand, and please don't even question them. That's it goes to my earlier point about this industry thrives on innovation, and I don't think no one ever says this turbine's now perfect, I'm going to stop innovating. And I see the same level of focus from the OAT members on the development process and development cycle, and people question, frankly, everything. It's a healthy forum.
Absolutely. And I think the conversations I find myself having is as people are almost scared at how innovative and how fast growing and how fast changing something like this, even though it has, 10 to 12 year sort of, or concept to build type cycle, a lot can change in 10 to 12 years. So it is a unique industry in one way. It's not like, I don't want to compare it to like solar or something, which has its own challenges, etc. But the innovation can be pushed through quite quickly in some ways. Well, here you're having to make some decisions quite early on, and the good thing is people are talking about it. I
Yeah,
mean,
correct. There's a huge that you're right. There's a huge focus, and and a lot of goodwill in the system, which is really helpful. And obviously, you look at the OAT task force members. There are people from companies that aggressively compete with each other, and that's fine. And they compete for their Crown Estate leases, and they compete for their CFDs, and frankly, they compete for the supply chain. And they're robust competitors, um, they're contributing at the OAT level for the good of the country as opposed to anything else. So not for their own sort of company specific issues, but to try and improve the system for everybody.
absolutely. Okay. And then in terms of that history, we started to talk about some of the history of the UK. We talked about how the UK is not exactly a stranger to floating structures. The UK is not a stranger to the marine industry, the offshore sector, etc. And I guess part of that's come through the history in the oil and gas industry, as well as, of course, other industries. But that is a major one, and well, like yourself and others, folks have transitioned over from that industry into this one. Um, can I ask you, sort of, maybe initially broadly, how are you seeing that overlap, should we call it, with the oil and gas industry here? Um, on one hand, there's a discussion, a debate that goes on around energy security, and then there's the whole, how do we continue to have oil and gas and transition to more renewables? And in one way, we're trying to sort of, as a country, balance that debate. So how do you see that overlap happening, and how is it filtering through the conversations you're having? And then I guess, secondly, how is that overlap happening in terms of access to that supply chain, the skills, and those are the more practical, technical day-to-day things that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of um, almost direct overlaps. So going back to the point about use of the marine space, there's different initiatives. Obviously, you have offshore wind farm development, but you also have things like repurposing reservoirs for CO2 storage, as well as ongoing oil and gas extraction. So, there's a direct sort of relationship there and need to coexist in that marine environment. Um, there's some interesting new projects coming through in Scotland as part of the INTOG program, should be launched later this year, where you're effectively deploying offshore wind to decarbonize offshore oil and gas installations. So, a real hand in glove type development. Um, on the supply chain, we hosted a supply chain roundtable at 10 Downing Street a few weeks ago. I mean, it was a really fun event. The participants, I think, really enjoyed it. There was a very robust conversation and debate. Um, but one story I told there was, so back in 1998, as a junior lawyer, I was sent off to Baku in Azerbaijan to do some homework on whether the firm I was working for should open an office there. And at that time, Baku was basically Aberdeen on the Caspian. The BP and others had signed very large contracts to develop the fields in Azerbaijan. And you know what? The Aberdeen services community had just taken it by the scruff of the neck and descended on Baku and everywhere you went, it was like the next Scottish pub opening, the somebody opened a bowling alley, um, and it was great fun. It was a bit of a Wild West type of thing, but it absolutely showed you what we've achieved in, particularly in Aberdeen, but also across the UK, in terms of that oil and gas skill set and mindset. And y- if I wind the clock forward, particularly around floating offshore wind, if we could get to a point where, new country X decides to go into floating offshore wind in a big way, and you know what, a whole bunch of Brits descend on the place and actually do it for them, that would be a wonderful, industrial legacy for the country, and a really positive outcome from us being the sort of first movers in this kind of space. So the so going back to the point on skill sets. I mean, I personally think, having done it myself now from a legal perspective, I'm not an engineer, but offshore wind is not that big of a leap from oil and gas. And anecdotally, I'm hearing that companies that do both, lots of engineers within the organizations are saying, you know what, I'd like to be in the offshore wind part now, please. So I think we need to recognize the two. There's a lot of synergies between the two industries, and we should harness that. We should absolutely harness it. And frankly, companies which are operating still solely in oil and gas, particularly on the service side and the professional side, there's very little barrier to moving across. And in fact, it's probably a great idea to have a look.
Yeah. No, absolutely, absolutely. I think there's a lot of work that's been done around the gaps of skills and whether it's manufacturing or whatever it is. The gaps are big across the board. So there's certainly an opportunity to go after. But I mean, I really liked your point around where whether it's Brits descending or at least the skills from that we've developed and exporting those across the world is of course a very exciting prospect. And that is precisely, I guess, what's going to be happening is that the world is going to develop offshore wind now. It's not a UK, a bit of Europe, and China. Of course, China's big and will continue to grow significantly. We should not forget about the Chinese offshore wind market. It's many other parts of the world, right? Brazil is clearly leading the charge in many ways, but we've talked about Philippines, the US, all with different timelines. But these are going to be big offshore wind markets. And that's going to lead to a lot of the people you're talking to on a day-to-day basis, these companies and investors, to go, well, where is my most bang for buck, my biggest, most attractive investment as such. The UK has been a leader and is and continues to be a leader and is looking to maybe solve some of the kind of challenges that we've talked about today. But what, in your mind, does the UK kind of need to do to remain attractive for the offshore wind industry going forward? What is it that needs to sort of stay there as the kind of premier offshore wind country that you want to do business with?
Yeah, look, I think we need to remember that we've come a long way, and we are, world leading, and we're already, frankly, a fantastic place to do business. People, you can certainly accelerate the timeline for deployment. That's a good thing to do. Um, People have their views on our dual auction structure, where we bid high for Crown Estate leases and low for CFDs. Um, but people also recognise that it's done a great job for the country in lowering strike prices, and the thing that the CFD does in terms of a destination for investment. It provides you with an absolutely rock solid um, mechanism to deliver a fixed price for your power, and we shouldn't underestimate the benefits of that in terms of attracting investment. So I am attracting capital investment in this kind of international marketplace isn't top of my list of worries. My list of worries are more around the supply chain, and especially and things that there's a shortage, for example, in some of the specialist vessels that are used to install offshore wind farms. And you hear these horror stories now of some of the bigger vessels heading over the Atlantic to the US for the summer season of installation, because rates are higher and there's more profit to be made. And I think that's where that's the sort of thing that should keep policymakers up at night, not just in the UK, but in Europe, because I think there's a sort of Atlantic competition going on there. Hopefully it will stimulate more of those vessels to be built. But to me, the international competition is very much in the supply chain side of it. Obviously, there is a link between that and the way the CFD drives prices. But I think that's where I think the main concern is attracting capital. I think the UK system attracts a lot of capital, and there seems to be, talking to people in the industry, lots of capital out there to deploy into UK CFD backed offshore wind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, it was testament, I guess, to the system that there was still quite a large participation in the latest CFD round. There was even maybe a worry that people wouldn't take part as much as they would, but actually they took part, and it went down a few percentage points in terms of the strike price, and people still felt that was sufficient to invest. Okay, Tim, thank you. I think we've come to the end of our time, but thank you so much for sharing, first of all, what an offshore wind champion actually is, but the vitally important role that you are playing, and just the sort of perspective that you have on from what you've seen, in terms of the challenges that need addressing and the balance that we need to strike to be able to, well, I guess essentially reach that 50 gigawatt target and maybe be the export hub for offshore wind of the world.
Thanks, David. It's been a pleasure.
Perfect. And thanks everyone for listening as well. I hope you enjoyed it. Please make sure you subscribe, give us a good rating, and share with your friends. Talk to you next time.